Welcome back. Let's dive into the story. Chapter 8. The Noise in the Valley. Now soon we had gotten to the boat into safety, which did with the most feverish haste. The boatswain gave his attention to his job, for the boy had not yet recovered the oar that dealt him breath the chin when the monster snatched it. For a while, his attentions produced no effect, but presently, having bathed the lad's face with water from the sea and rubbed rum into his chest over the heart, the youth began to show life. And soon opened his eyes, whereupon the bosun gave him a stiff dram of the rum, after cried in a weak voice that he was dizzy, and his head and neck ached badly, on hearing which the bosun made him keep laying until he had come more to himself. And so we left him in quietness under the little shade of the canvas and reeds. Oops. And we left him on night. Why is this not working? Apologies, un momento. Thank you. Alright, let's find this chapter. And... Oops, I'm way too bob. This way. There we go. I don't want 10. I need... There it is. Apologies. Alright, back at it. Thank you for your patience. At a little distance under the directing of the bosun, we made to prepare dinner, for we were now very hungry, and at a little distance underneath, under the directing of the bosun, we've been preparing for dinner, for we are now very hungry. It was seeming a great while since we had broken our fast. Apologies, getting everything set up again. I know. I failed you. What can I possibly do to make it all up? Except read more. And more. And more! Alright, back to the story. Greatest apologies, I am a fool. But anyway, now you can't really see my face, but we can only do so much. Trust me, that's one of the last things you want to be memorized with is this face. Alright, come on, you. Adjust. Ooh. For we intend... Oops. To this end, the bosun sent two of the men across the island to gather some of the dry seaweed, for we intended to cook some of the salt meat, this being first cooked meal since eating meat which we had boiled before leaving the ship in the creek. In the meanwhile, and until the return of the men with the fuel, the bosun kept us busied in various ways. There we go. Much better. 2 he said to cut bundle of reed, and another couple to bring the meat and the oil in the iron boiler. The latter being one that we had taken from the old brig. Presently, the men returned with dry seaweed, and very curious stuff it seemed, some of it being in chunks near as thick as a man's body, but exceedingly brittle, by the reasons of dryness. And in so little, we had a very good fire going, which we fed with the seaweed and pieces of reeds, though we found the latter to be a bit indifferent fuel, having too much sap, and being troublesome to break into convenient size. Now, when the fire had grown red and hot, the bosun had filled the boiler with seawater, which he placed the meat, and the pan having a stout lid, he did not scruple to place it in the very heart of the fire, so that soon we had the content boiling merrily. Having gotten the dinner underway, the bosun set about preparing our camp for the night, which we did, making a rough framework with the reeds, over which we spread the boat's sail with the cover, pegging the canvas down with tough splinters of the reed. When this was completed, we set to and carried. There was all of our stores, after which the bosun took over to the other side of the island to gather the fuel for the night, which we did. Each man bearing a great double armful. Now by the time we had brought over, each of us, 2 loads of the fuel, we have found the meat to be cooked. And so, without more ado, we set ourselves down and made a very good meal of it and some biscuits, after which we had each of us some sound tot of the rum. Having made an end of eating and drinking, the bosun went over to where Job lay to inquire into how he felt. Having made the end of eating and drinking, the bosun went over to where Job lay to inquire how he felt. And the boy was lying very quiet, though his breathing was heavy, a heavy touch about it. However, we will conceive of nothing by which might be bettered, since so left him. However, it would be conceived of nothing by which he might be bettered, so left him. Being more hopeful that the nature would bring him to a health than any other skill of which we possessed. I know, I'm still messing around with this, but I'm trying to get it. And currently, perfection is not being held. Why? Okay. Now, can you hear me? And see me? Why, look at that. I am horrifically looking. And that's okay, because... Aha! Much better. I apologize. Back to the reading. By this time it was late afternoon, and so that the bosun declared we might please ourselves until sunset, deeming that we had earned a very good night to rest. But that from sunset till dawn we should, he told us, have each of us to take turn to watch. For though we were no longer upon the water, none might say whether we were out of danger or not. As witness of the happenings of the morning, though certainly he apprehended no danger from the devilfish as long as we kept well away from the water's edge. And so, from now until dark, most of the men slept, but the bosun spent much of his time in overhauling the boat to see how it might chance to have suffered during the storm, and so whether the struggles of the devilfish had strained it in any way. And indeed, it was speedily evident the boat would need some attention, with the plank on the bottom next to the one to the keel upon the starboard side had burst inwards. This having been done, it would seem by some rock in the beach hidden just beneath the water's edge, the devilfish having no doubt ground the boat down upon it. Happily, the damage was not great, though most certainly it had to be carefully repaired before the boat again seaworthy. For the rest, there seemed to be no other part needing attention. Now, I felt not any call to sleep, as I followed the bosun to the boat, giving him a hand to remove the bottom boards, and finally to slew her bottom a little upwards, so that he might examine the leak more closely. When he had made an end with the boat, he went over to the stores and looked closely into the condition, and also see how long they were lasting. And after that, he sounded all the water beakers, having done which he remarked that it would do well for us if we could discover any fresh water upon the island. By this time it was getting on towards evening, and now his bosun went across to look at Job, finding him as much as he'd been when we had visited him after dinner, and that the bosun asked me to bring across one of the longer bottom boards, which I did, and we made use of it as a stretcher to carry the lad into the tent, and afterwards we carried all the loose woodwork off the boat into the tent, emptying the lockers of their contents, which included some oakum, a small bow's hatchet, coal of 1.5 inch hemp line. We saw a good saw, an empty Cazola oil tin, a bag of copper nails, some bolts and washers, 2 fishing lines, 3 spare tholes, and 3 pronged rein without the shaft, 2 balls of spun yarn, 3 bags of roping twine, and a piece of canvas with 4 roping needles stuck in it, the boat's lamp, a spare plug, and a roll of light duck for making boat sails. And so presently, the dark had come down upon the island, at which the bosun waked the men, and made them to throw more fuel on the fire, which had burned down to the mound of glowing embers was shrouded in ash. After that, one of them filled the boiler with fresh water, and soon we were occupied most pleasantly upon the supper of cold boiled salt meat, hard biscuits, and rum mixed with hot water. During supper, the bosun made clear. Oops. Poop. Okay. After that, one of them filled the bar to the boiler with fresh water, and soon we were occupied most pleasantly upon a supper of cold boiled salt meat, hard biscuits, and rum mixed with hot water. During supper, the bosun made clear to the men regarding the watches, arranging how they should follow, so that I found I was set down to take my turn from the midnight until 1 of the clock. And then he explained to them about the burst blank in the bottom of the boat, and how it had to be put right before we could hope to leave the island. And after that night, we should probably go more strictly on the victuals, for it seemed to be nothing upon the island that we, up until then, discovered fit to satisfy our bellies. More than this, if we could find no fresh water, he should have to distill some to make up for that which we had drunk, and this must be done before leaving the island. By now, the time that the bosun had made an end of explaining these matters, we had ceased from eating, and soon after this we made each one of us a comfortable place in the sand within the tent, and lay down to sleep. For a while, I found myself very wakeful, which may have because of the warmth of the night, and indeed, at last I got up and went out to the tent, conceiving that it might be better if I sleep in the open air, and so it proved. For having lain down in the side of the tent a little way from the fire, I fell soon into a deep slumber, which at first was dreamless. Presently, however, I came upon a very strange and unsettling dream, for I dreamed that I had been left alone in the island. It was sitting very desolate upon the edge of the brown scummed pit. Then I was aware that how very dark and very silent, and I began to shiver, for it seemed to me that something which repulsed my whole being had come quietly behind me, that I tried mightily to turn and look into the shadow among the great fungi. That stood all about me, but I had no power to turn, and thing was coming nearer, though never a sound came to me. But I gave out a scream, or tried to, but my voice made no stir in the rounding quiet. Then something wet cold touched my face and slithered down to cover my mouth, and paused there for a vile, breathless moment, and passed onward and fell into my throat, and stayed there. Someone stumbled and fell over my feet, and at that I was suddenly awake. There was a man on which making a walk around the back of the tent, and he had not known of my presence till he fell over my boots. He was somewhat shaken and startled, as may be supposed, but steadied himself leaning on the no wild creature crouched there in the shadow, and all the time I answered his inquiries. I was full of a strange, horrid feeling that something had left me in the moment of my awakening. There was a slight hateful odor in my nostrils, and that was not altogether unfamiliar. And then suddenly I was aware my face was damp, and there was a curious sense of tingling in my throat. I put my hand and felt my face, and the hand, when I brought it away, was slippery with slime, and then I put up my other hand and touched my throat, and there was the same, only in addition there was a slight swell place where one side of the windpipe, so the place where the bite of the mosquito will make. But I had no thought to blame any mosquito. Now the stumbling of the man over me, my awakening and discovering my face and throat were beslimed, but there was happenings of some few short instants, and then I was upon my feet, then following him around to the fire, for I had a sense of chilliness and a great desire not to be alone. And now, having come to the fire, I took some of the water, and that I had been left in the boiler, and washed my face and neck, after which I felt more my own man. And then I asked the man to look at my throat, so that he might have some idea of the manner of place the ground swelling seemed, and he, lighting a piece of the dry seaweed to acted as torch, made examination of my neck, but could see little, save a number of small ring-like marks, red inwardly and white at the edges, of someone was bleeding slightly. After that I asked him whether he had seen anything moving around the tent, but he had seen nothing during all the time he had been on watch. Though it's true, he said he heard odd noises, but nothing very near at hand. Of the place of my throat he seemed to think but little, suggesting I had been bitten by some sort of sand fly. But at that I shook my head and told him of my dream, and after that he was as anxious to keep near as me as I to him. And so the night passed onward, until my turn came to watch. For a little while the man who unrelieved sat beside me, having I could see the kindly intent of keeping me company. But so soon as perceived this, I entreated him to go and get sleep, assuring him I had no longer any feelings of fear. Such had been mine upon awakening and discovering the state of my face and throat, and upon this he consented to leave me, and so, in a little, I sat alone beside the fire. For a certain space, I kept very quiet, listening, but no sound came to me out of the surrounding darkness. Apologies. There we go. And for a little while, already did that, blah blah blah. For a certain space, I kept very quiet, listening, but no sound came unto me the surrounding distance, surrounding darkness, and so as though it were a fresh thing, I was born upon me how that we were in a very abominable place of lonesomeness and desolation, and I grew very solemn. Thus, as I sat, the fire, which had not been replenished for a while, dwindled steadily until I gave but a dullish glow around. And then in the direction of the valley I heard some sound of a dull thud noise coming to me, though the stillness was very much startling clearness. At that I perceived I was not doing my duty to the rest nor to myself by sitting and allowing the fire to cease from flaming. Immediately approaching myself, I seized a cast mass of the dry weed upon the fire, and with a great blaze shot up into the night. Afterwards I glanced quickly right and left, holding my cut and thrust very readily, and most thankful to the Almighty that I had brought no harm to any by reason of my carelessness, which I inclined me to believe was that the strange inertia which bred by fear. And then, even as I looked around me, there came to me across the silence of the beach a fresh noise, a continual soft slithering to and fro in the bottom of the valley, as though a multitude of creatures moved stealthily. At this, I threw more fuel in the fire, and after I fixed my eyes, gazed in the direction of the valley. Thus, in the following instant, it seemed to me that I saw a certain thing, as it might be a shadow, move on the outer borders of the firelight, and the man who kept watch before me had left his spear stuck upright in the sand convenient to my grasp. Seeing something move, I seized my weapon and hurled it with all my strength in its direction. But there came no answering cry to tell I'd struck anything living, and immediately afterwards there fell once more a great silence upon the island, being broken only by a far splash upon the weed. It may be convinced with truth that above the happenings there was a very considerable strain upon my nerves, so I looked to and fro with ever and anon a glance behind me, for it seemed to me that I might expect some demonic creature to rush upon me at any moment. Yet for the space of many minutes there came neither any sight nor sound of living creature, so that I knew not what to think, but being near to doubting if I heard any aught beyond the common. And then, even as I made halt upon the threshold of doubt, I was assured that I had not been mistaken, for abruptly I was aware that all the valley was full of rustling, scampering sort of noise, through which there came to me an occasional soft thuds in the anon of the former slithering sounds, and that, thinking a host of evil things to be upon me, I cried out to the bosun, and the men were to awake. Immediately, upon my shout, the bosun rushed out from the tent, the men following, everyone with his weapon, save the man who had left his spear in the sand, and that lay somewhere beyond the light of the fire. And the bosun shouted to know what the thing had caused me to cry out, but I replied nothing, only held up my hand for quietness. Yet, when this was granted, the noises of the valleys had ceased, so that the bosun turned to me, being in need of some explanation. But I begged him to hark a little longer, which he did. And the sounds recommencing almost immediately, he heard sufficient to know that I had not waked him without due cause. And then as we stood, each one of us staring up into the darkness where it lay the valley, I seemed to see again some shadowy thing upon the boundary of the firelight. In the same instant, one of the men cried out to cast his spear into the darkness, but the bosun turned upon him with very great anger for throwing his weapon. The man had left himself without, and thus brought danger to the whole. Yet, as will be remembered, I had done likewise but a little since. Presently there was coming again a quietness within the valley, and none knowing what might be towards, the bosun carting up a mass of dry weed, and lighting it at the fire, ran towards a portion of the beach which lay between us and the valley. Here he cast it upon the sand, singing out that some men bring more weed, and that we might have a fire there, and thus being able to see if anything may come out of the deepness of the hollow. Presently, there was a very good fire, and the light of the two spears were discovered, both of them stuck in the sand, and no more than 1 yard from another, which seemed to have a very strange thing. Now, for a while after the lightning of the setting fire, there came no further sound of the direction of the valley. Nothing indeed to break the quietness of the island, save the occasional lonely splashes that sound from time to time out of the vastness of the weed continent. Then about an hour and a half after I'd watched wake the bosun, one of the men who had been tending to the fires came upon him to say that they had come to an end of our supply of weed fuel. At that point the bosun looked very blank, which did the rest of us as well we might, for there was no help for it until the men bethought him of the remainder of the bundle of reeds which we had got, in which, burning but poorly, we had discarded for the weed. This was discovered to be the back of the tent where it fed the fire and burned between us and the valley. For the other we suffered to die out, for the reeds were not sufficient to support even one until the dawn. At last, whilst it was still dark, we came to the end of our fuel, and as the fire died down, so did the noises in the valley recommence. And there we stood in the growling dark, each one a very ready weapon, and a more ready glance at that island would be mightily quiet. And then again, the sound of things crawling in the valley. Yet I think the silence has tried us the more. And so, at last came the dawn. Apologies. I will be back shortly. I just gotta go and use the facilities of biological waste elimination, to put it politely. But I shall be back in a bit. Don't travel far, you know. You might get eaten by something in the dark.